Hey there, folks, and welcome back to another episode in this Basics of Web Development tutorial series. In the last episode, we looked at JavaScript loops and functions, and today we're going to talk about some of the more common string and array methods. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, a method is essentially a function that comes prepackaged with a specific data type. I just want to touch on a few of these before we finally dive into using JavaScript alongside our HTML and CSS. So first, I'm just going to get rid of all of our old code to clean things up and make it easier to follow along. As always, I'll keep the old code in the version I post to GitHub, link in the description, so you can reference it there if you need to. So first, let's talk about some string methods. And we'll start by creating a new string. Call it greeting. We'll set it to hey there, folks. The first thing we can check about this string is technically not a method at all. It's a property, but we can access it in a very similar way by using dot notation, and that is the length property. So we can log greeting.length, and this returns the number of characters in the string, which in this case is 17. The length property can also be used on arrays and will return the number of elements in that array, which we saw in the last episode when we made some loops that go through each element of an array. Now, the first actual method we'll look at is the includes method. So just like the length property, we will call this using dot notation. Change that to includes. But since methods are functions, we also need to add a set of parentheses after the method name. And inside those parentheses, we'll pass in a string as the argument. What this method does is checks whether the string inside these parentheses exists anywhere within the string the method is being called on, which in this case is greeting. And as you might expect, this returns true. If I were to replace hey with hello, now it returns false because hello is nowhere to be found in the string greeting. Now, similar to the includes method, there are also the starts with and ends with methods. These work much in the same way, but instead of checking anywhere in the string, they specifically check the beginning or end of the string. So let's try this. And looking at the last two lines in the console, we see true and false. So this confirms that the string starts with a capital H, but doesn't it also end with the word folks? Well, technically it doesn't. It ends with folks, exclamation point. If we changed ends with to includes or added an exclamation point to the argument, this would return true. But since there are extra characters after the word folks in the greeting string, just using the word folks in the ends with call returns false. All right, next up, let's take a look at the substring method. For this method, we pass in two numbers as arguments. These represent the starting index and the ending index of the part of the string, or the substring, that we want to extract. For example, if I wanted to pull the word there from the greeting string, we first need the index of the letter T, which is 4, and then for the second argument, we use the index of the comma after the E, which is 9. The second argument, the end index, is non-inclusive. So that means this will return the substring starting at index 4 and going up to index 9, but not including index 9. So when we run the code, we see the result of this method call, which is just the word there. And finally, the last string method I want to show you in this video is the split method. This method splits a string into an array of smaller strings. All we need to do is tell it which character or set of characters we want to split the string on. So for example, let's try this. Here, we're using a single space character as the split value. In our greeting string, there are two spaces, one between hey and there, and another between the comma and the word folks. Those are the points where the string will be split. So, when we run this, an array is logged to the console with three strings in it: hey, there with a comma, and folks with an exclamation point. You'll notice that none of these strings include spaces anymore. When we split the string at the space characters, those spaces are removed in the process. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not limited to just a single character in the split argument. For example, I could add a comma before the space here, and let's see what that gives us. So now we get an array with two strings. The first is hey space there, and the second is folks with an exclamation point. Since there's no comma between hey and there, they stay together as a single string in the first element of the resulting array. On the topic of arrays, let's move on to some array methods. Before we do, I'll just comment out all of the string method console logs, and let's create a new array. The first array method we'll look at is the push method. This method is going to add a new element to the end of the array. This method will permanently change the colors array. With the string methods we looked at earlier, the original greeting string was never modified. Those methods just returned new values. That's not the case here. Push is what's called a mutating method, meaning it actually changes the original array that we're calling it on. So now if we log the colors array after calling push, we can see the results in the console, and the array now contains red, green, and blue. Now, while push adds a new element to the end of an array, we can use the pop method to remove an element from the end of an array. To avoid confusion, I'll remove the push call and just replace it with pop. And unlike push, we don't need to pass in any arguments. So now we start with an array containing the strings red and green, but after the pop call, we see that colors now only has one element left, the string red. So what happened to green? Where did it go? Well, in the current state of the code, it's gone, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Not only does pop remove the last element of the array, but it also returns that element. That means that we can store the result of the pop call to a variable, and then we can log that new variable. And in the console, we can see that the value of the last variable is the string green. All right, so we've been using push and pop to add and remove elements from the end of an array, but there's also a pair of methods that work on the beginning of an array: unshift and shift. Similar to push, we can use unshift to add a new element to the beginning of the array. And similar to pop, we can use shift to remove the first element of the array. As you might expect, shift doesn't just remove the first element, it also returns it, which means we can store that value in a variable if we needed to. Now, the final method we'll look at for adding or removing elements to an array is the splice method. Splice is a little bit more complex than the other four we just went over: push, pop, shift, and unshift, because not only can it add elements anywhere in an array, beginning, middle, or end, it can also remove elements at the same time. So first, let's get rid of our pop example. And let's start the colors array with 3 values and just add blue here. Then we'll call splice. So the splice method can take 3 or more arguments. The first argument is a number that represents the index of where we want the splicing to start. For example, 0 means the beginning of the array, 1 means after red, 2 means after green, and so on. The second argument is another number that represents how many elements we want to remove. So if we use 1 for both of the first 2 arguments, we're telling JavaScript to start at index 1, so that's right after the string red, and remove one element, which would be the string green. Finally, any remaining arguments are the elements that we want to add. So let's add yellow and purple. And then we'll move the console log after the splice call. And so as a result, we can see that the colors array now contains red, followed by yellow and purple, which we just added, and then blue. The string green has been removed. If you want to add elements without removing anything, you can just use 0 as the second argument. And now we see that all 5 colors are in the colors array. And if you want to remove elements without adding any, you just need to use the first 2 arguments and leave out the rest. So with using a 2 for the second argument, we've removed both green and blue, but we didn't add anything else in its place. Next on our list of array methods is one that, for obvious reasons, gets mixed up with splice a lot, and that is slice. Slice is to arrays what substring is to strings. It returns a new array, so it's a non-mutating method, and it gives us a specified subsection of the array that it's called on. The arguments work very similarly as well. The first argument is the index we want to start at, and the second argument is the index we want to end at, but is non-inclusive. So if we want a subarray that contains only the first 2 elements of colors, we can use const subarray equals colors.slice, and we'll do 0 and 2. So here we're telling JavaScript to start at and include index 0 and then stop at but not include index 2. If we log this after logging colors, what we see is that the colors array is completely untouched and still contains all 3 strings, while subarray only contains the first 2 elements, red and green. So the last array method I want to go over in this video is the for each method. If you recall from the last episode, we wrote a for loop that we use to loop over all of the elements in an array. Well, the for each method does the same thing. It executes a block of code for each element in an array. So we can call the for each method on the colors array. And inside the parentheses, we will pass in an arrow function. Inside the parentheses of the arrow function, we'll add a parameter that represents the individual elements in the colors array as we loop through it. So we can just call this color. So with this, on the first iteration, the value for the color parameter will be red. On the next iteration, it'll be green. And on the third iteration, it'll be blue. Finally, inside the function body, we can just add console.log, I like, and concatenate the color parameter. And when we save and run the code, we get an error. Oh, I spelled console wrong. Okay, let's undo that and let's try again. All right. Well, we see I like red, I like green, and I like blue logged to the console, each on its own line, all coming from the for each method call. So anytime you need to do something with each element of an array, the for each method offers a more clean and readable way to do that compared to a traditional for loop. And with that, folks, those are all of the methods I wanted to go over in this video. There are, of course, many more than this, and there are even a handful of useful methods for numbers as well. For now, though, I just wanted to introduce the idea of methods in general and walk through some of the more commonly used ones. I'll leave a few links in the description to some additional, more in-depth references for string and array methods if you're interested. And this also wraps up all of the programming fundamentals that I wanted to cover. So in the next episode, we can finally loop back to our HTML and CSS and learn how to introduce JavaScript into that code to make our web page more interactive. As always, if you've learned something or just enjoyed the video, consider supporting the channel with a like or a subscription. It really does help, and I always appreciate it. Other than that, I will see you in the next video.